Hi, the name of the book that I chose for my book talk is called Golden Silk Smoke, A History of Tobacco in China from 1550 to 2010. It was written and published in 2012, and the author is named Carol Benedict. She is an associate professor of history at Georgetown, and her specialties are social and cultural history of China in the 19th and the 20th century, with a specific focus on medicine, women and gender studies, disease, and consumer culture. I found this book by looking through Chinese social topics for this project, which led me to looking through the GT section of the library. This book makes an interesting connection between the rise of tobacco usage in China and China's opening to the rest of the world. Another connection that this book attempts to make is that the American process of smoking eventually became Chinese. The brutally honest reason I chose this book was because time was running out of class, but I kept it because I found the latter claim interesting enough for me to skim through the book. But also, I found it interesting that Benedict dove into a huge chunk of Chinese history, especially because I, before, practically knew nothing about the history of tobacco usage in China. And her specific background is very well reflected in this book, based on the chapter titles in the table of contents. For example, the fourth chapter is titled Tobacco in Mingqing Medical Culture. And the final chapter focuses on the specific decline of female smokers in China. This background and these perspectives allow for a really interesting perspective for the social and literal evaluation of tobacco usage and consumption in China, due to its ability to aid in the conversation of how and why tobacco usage became a thing there. The history of tobacco usage in China, based on my initial scan of the book, is heavily tied to globalization, specifically the British, and their influence on China's taking of tobacco as a product from the New World. And China had and has an influence on American smoking culture. Eugenia Lean, a reviewer of the book, summarizes the introduction of tobacco in China as having entered China initially through maritime trade zones and spread inland through China's empire-wide marketing system. Family farms in the middle of the Yangtze River quickly adapted tobacco as a commercial crop. And that's on page 761 of her review. The initial reaction of this book's publication was mixed. Lean mentions that the book documents the complexity and contingency of local adaptations of tobacco in China over time, and it demonstrates that the spread of tobacco in any form, snuff, water pipe tobacco, or manufactured cigarette, was never inevitable or natural. Instead, tobacco's spread in China was inextricably linked to domestic production patterns, intricate customer cultures that were at once stratified and inclusive, the acquired appreciation of smoking practices, and specific cultural meanings associated with the product. And that's on 761. However, this positivity didn't save the book from criticism. Lean identifies some of the book's biggest issues as relating to the approach to cover 5 centuries worth of history in 254 pages. Lean criticizes that her longue durée approach risks over-determine continuity, overlooking significant changes between and within purported temporal limits, and creating an impression of theology. And that's on 762. Lean further goes on to explain that by characterizing the whole of the 20th century as a single era, the study fails to appreciate how the manifestation of cigarettes might have constituted a radical break. It seems to overinterpret the significance of turn-of-the-century reformist discourses against female smoking, which it Anna chronologically emphasizes to explain the decline of female smoking in the post-1949 era, and that's on 763 of her book review. However, David Bellow, another reviewer of the book, mentioned that it is debatable whether Benedict has been able to portray the nearly 500-year history of Chinese tobacco as it actually happened in only 254 pages. She has provided an appropriately globalized and argumentative overview of the considerable literature on the subject, and that's on page 159 of his book. Out of these reviews, I tend to agree with Bellows more than Lean. It is ambitious to claim that one is able to compile a concise history of 5 centuries worth of tobacco usage in less than 3,000 pages in a country like China. But it is not impossible to do a concise analysis of a few social factors in the pages that were printed. And I think Benedict did a decent job at this. And her shortcomings on the former shouldn't discount the fact that she did a good job. Had this book been updated to fully include the 2010s, it might have mentioned more about China's becoming more dominant in the global tobacco industry. Further reading on the topic has mentioned that China has become the world's cigarette superpower. By 2014, factories that were already cranking out almost half the world's cigarettes. In case you're curious, that number is 2.6 trillion cigarettes. Additionally, while Benedict is not an economist, it might have been interesting for some perspective from that angle as well. The Chinese government holds a monopoly on its tobacco industry, which, according to Tai Weihu, has provided 8 to 11% of China's revenue in both profit and tax over the past decade. Additionally, there was a cigarette tax added in 2015. So the impacts of that would be interesting to look at in a few years. Perhaps, maybe now that some time has passed, it would be possible for someone to do an updated version of a multi-dimensional analysis of China's relationship with tobacco in the modern age. Thanks.